So I've been studying Cantonese for a month, and hell yes, it is an interesting language. In this video, I'm going to talk about the similarities between Vietnamese, which is my mother tongue, and Cantonese. The two languages are extremely similar vocabulary-wise and pronunciation-wise. Not to mention that both languages have 6 tones. But let's not get ahead of myself. Now let's get into the important part of learning any Chinese languages. Chinese characters. Now, I've been studying Japanese for over a year now, so I do have a little bit of knowledge about Chinese characters and radicals and that sort of thing. But traditional Chinese is just on another level of difficulty. If you know a bit about the East Asian languages, you may be tempted to think that the Chinese language actually had a lot of influence on languages like Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. And you'd be right, of course, apart from the Chinese character part. So the Vietnamese language actually has something called the Sino-Vietnamese vocabulary, and it's basically a bunch of Vietnamese words that have been kind of transliterated from the Chinese language. So let's take an example, right? Let's say we have the word for a thesis essay. What is it in Chinese?
Luận văn.
And in Vietnamese, it would be
luận văn.
pretty similar, right? Now let us take the second character and combine it with another character, and now we have the word for culture. And yes, they all share the same meaning across other languages, except for some occasions though, where there is actually a slight deviation in meaning between the languages. So like, for example, Hoi Sam doesn't actually exist in Japanese, but in Vietnamese it actually means to broaden your horizons in a spiritual way. At least that's how I've heard this word used. I tend to go on random Chinese websites and try to read them with my humble knowledge of kanji. But then one day I came across this banner and imagine how confused I was when I saw this. At first, I thought it meant something like buy condom, experience epiphany. But then I realized buying condoms didn't have anything to do with spirituality, so I had to look it up. And boom. Turns out it just means to be happy. There are also many more cases of this, such as Thảo Sinh. It's actually Đầu Tiên in Vietnamese, but it means first and foremost in Vietnamese instead of a moment ago like in Cantonese. Also, can I just talk briefly about something? The fact that both Viet and Viet share the same reading did confuse me a little bit at first. When I went on the vietping.org site, I thought it was talking about the Vietnamese language, but when I switched to Chinese, I quickly realized it was talking about Cantonese. Also, here's the funny story. At some point in history, Vietnam was actually named Đại Ngu, Great Peace. But guess what? This character, which means stupid, also reads as ngu, and is the only meaning of the word ngu that Vietnamese people know today. So whenever we hear Đại Ngu, the first thing we think of is the big stupid. And that's why we tend to use Sino-Vietnamese words when it's in compounds. That way, there's less risk of misunderstanding. I think it's much like Chinese. Also, if you're curious how I'm getting all my Sino-Vietnamese knowledge from, there are mainly 2 ways for a Vietnamese person to know about it. First, you either go to a Japanese or a Chinese class, and that's like the only instance I can think of that we actually learn about the Chinese characters. Also, there's like a Sino-Vietnamese dictionary at the end of our literature textbooks, but no one cares. Second, there is this cool website called HV Dictionary that indexes virtually all Chinese characters that I've learned. I use it all the time for my Japanese studies, but I also use it to study Chinese as well. So for example, I was reading this site in Cantonese, and one of the lines read, Hôm nay họ cần đi đại lục xuất sai. Now, I don't know what "suk sai" means, so I looked it up and boom, there we go. It means to go on a business trip. Now, I'm going off on a tangent here, but apparently there are 2 ways to say to go on a business trip in Cantonese. One is for written Cantonese and one is for spoken Cantonese. In Vietnamese, I don't think we do that, though we definitely prefer to use Sino-Vietnamese words in official documents because it seems more formal that way. So like the word for marry is cưới, but in official documents you would say kết hôn. So yeah, it is a little different. Now on to pronunciation, I can tell that both Vietnamese and Cantonese pronunciation are not as close as I hoped it would be. People say that both languages have 6 tones, so they are a little similar, right? Not exactly. They have 6 tones, but the tones are different. And also, I speak a Vietnamese dialect that only has 5 tones. So first of all, let's talk about the tones. In Cantonese, you would have si, 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 si. People claim that there are an additional of 3 tones, sec, sec, sec. But guess what? In Vietnamese, the tones are
Si, 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 si.
Now, if I were to compare them, I would say the first tone in Vietnamese is too high. We don't have the 5th tone. In Okay, maybe the rest are a little similar, but I still have a lot of trouble trying to recognize the Cantonese tones, especially the second and the fifth tone. These two tones, I often hear native Cantonese speakers mix them up together, and it's kind of similar like in Vietnamese. A lot of dialects actually mix up the hoi and the nga. Now, let's stop talking about the tones and let's talk about the vowels, consonants, and diphthongs. Now, for the most part, these languages could be a little similar in that we share a lot of sounds. For example, so the word for happiness in Cantonese is
幸福
in Vietnamese it would be.
hạnh phúc,
The first time I heard it, I was like, no way. But let's talk about the ones that are actually different, like this thing right here. To put it simply, I've had lots of trouble trying to pronounce this, and it's everywhere, even in the word.
香港
Like, how do you even say it? I've done my research on Google, and apparently they say it's kind of similar to the as in the English word pho. So, Hong Kong? Maybe? Alright, now I'm going to talk a bit about grammar. I've only been studying vocabulary at this point, but I've learned a bit about Cantonese grammar. And yes, Cantonese is indeed similar to Vietnamese when it comes to grammar. In Vietnamese, saying I am John would be tôi là John. In Cantonese, it's ngõ hai John. In Vietnamese, even though là means to be, we don't use it when it's followed by an adjective. So for example, if I wanted to say I'm beautiful, I would say tôi thật đẹp or tôi đẹp lắm. The other day, I asked my grandma, Granny, how do you say I'm beautiful in Cantonese? And she said, ngõ hấu lang. And I was a bit confused, like why didn't you say ngõ hay lang? But then I realized we do the same thing in Vietnamese. My mind blown.